So today I'm going to be talking about the Blitz or Blitzkrieg in German. And yeah, this is basically this period from 1940 to 1941 in which Britain was attacked by German bombers, and it was a really terrible time to live in. It was horrible. So it was extremely dangerous just to live in the cities. I'm not even saying fight, just living in England was actually really dangerous. Well, it all started on the 7th of September 1940. Well, at 4:56 p.m., so like tea time, suddenly air raid sirens started going off, and people were like, "Oh my God, what is this? Why are sirens just ringing?" Turns out the German Air Force or the Luftwaffe were conducting this massive air raid over London with over 350 bombers. Had gone from the channel, had crossed the English Channel from France and dropped over 300 tons of bombs on the docks and streets on the east end of London. 300 tons. That is a lot of bombs. A lot. And these were air raids. Now, the reason it's called Blitzkrieg was because the Germans, in German, it's called the Blitz because in German it's Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. Krieg, I think, means war, Blitz, lightning. So for the Germans, it was just going really fast over this populated area in England and just dropping bombs. And it was actually really successful. It was very heavy bombing, very frequent, terrorizing the population, and it was Hitler's way of trying to decrease morale in the war. Rather than attack the aircraft, the British aircraft, it was just a way to try and have the people lose faith in the war so they wouldn't fight as much and therefore an attempt to win the war. This is actually a result of 1940, around that time, Germany was using the Luftwaffe against the RAF, actual dogfights over England, like aircrafts going against each other. But there was this one point where Hitler's like, no, we're gonna decrease morale. Apparently, the British were down to their last 12 aircraft. So this small decision by Hitler basically cost him the war. So yeah, and this Blitzkrieg was constant bombing night after night. It wasn't every single night, but really, really constant from September 1940 to May 1941. So quite a few months, and London actually, this was not only London, but London was bombed every day and night except for one for 11 weeks. Every day for 11 weeks except for one day. But still, it ended up having 1/3 of London being destroyed. That's a lot. I don't know how else to just explain it. It's a lot of destruction really efficiently by the Germans. However, they could have been concentrating on defeating the British Air Force. It cost them the war, but it was a really efficient way of trying to decrease morale. Kind of worked a bit, but not to the extent the Germans wanted to. Well, like I said, it was started on the 7th of September 1940 after the Battle for Britain, or Britain. I've seen it written both ways, but it's the same thing. Like I said, it were basically dogfights of aircraft over the English skies to try and defeat the RAF and win over England. However, Hitler and the German commanders said, let's just concentrate on demoralizing the population, and said, hey, let's bomb London. Over around 2,000 people were killed or wounded in London just on the first night, on the 7th of September, because of course there weren't any precautions put in place. From then on, air raid shelters and stuff was put in place. I'll get into it in a second, but these things were put in place to try and keep the people alive and survive. But by this point, September 1940, no one, this has never happened before. So why should the population expect this? And this surprise tactic actually kind of worked. I mean, 2,000 people were hurt or even killed. Now, during the first month, they dropped 5,300 tons of high explosive in London, in just 24 nights. Like I said, 300 tons were on the first night. Then, through the following 23 nights, it was 5,300 tons. And there were some bombings during the day, but most of them occurred during the night, when it was easier to, harder to detect the aircraft, so easier for them to just pass without really being seen because they were dark, and also the people weren't expecting it that much, especially at first, but also they were more tired for working during the whole day, so it was easier to kill them at night, if that makes sense. So of course, air raid sirens were already put in place since the war started, and it was first used in actual populated areas on the 7th of September 1940. Now, there were very loud sirens placed in large parts of the city, heavily populated parts, that sounded every time an enemy aircraft was spotted. Now, at first, they were quite rare, but by 1940, 1941, they were really common. You almost couldn't go a day, especially if you lived in London, without hearing the famous sound. I'm not even going to do the sound because I'm going to sound ridiculous, but it's just really annoying siren that if you heard it, you had to rush to an aircraft, to an bomb shelter, air raid shelter. And it was really, really, really loud and really annoying, but I mean, you took notice of it, you can just ignore it. So the pitch rose and fell. It was it was really annoying. You can just mistake it for any other random sound. And however, sometimes, I mean, it wasn't 100% effective. They only saw the raids if they detected the planes. Sometimes they didn't. So sometimes you could be just chilling, walking in the streets of London, although by some point people didn't really go on the streets because they were afraid a random raid would happen. But you would just be walking and suddenly, boom, a bomb. And there was no sirens, but of course they did try to warn people most of the time, but sometimes sirens just occurred without warning, like the raid, sorry. And when they heard this, like I said, they just rushed to a shelter or even to the underground. The underground actually acted as or the tube actually acted as an air raid shelter. Kind of really effective. And like I said, it wasn't only London who suffered from this. Other cities like Swansea, Cardiff, Bristol, Southampton, Plymouth, Birmingham, Coventry, Liverpool, big cities were targets of this because the Germans hoped to demoralize large populated areas. If they just bombed villages and small places, that wouldn't really be effective. If they bombed London, Liverpool, people would really take notice and word would spread really fast. And that's exactly what they wanted. The biggest air raid the world has ever had was actually not in London, but in Coventry, which is I think it's in the Midlands. It's near Warwick in England. It was in November 1940, so a couple months after the air raids officially started. 554 people were killed, 4,330 homes were destroyed, and at one point there were 200 fires just raging in Coventry. And it wasn't even London. Of course, you were a normal citizen, you would see this and be terrified and lose morale. That's exactly what the Germans wanted. But actually, British society really came together and didn't lose that much morale. Society really bonded in this because stronger together, And, well, it was quite successful for the Nazis, not to this point they wanted it to be, but they actually managed to kill over 32,000 civilians. Not even soldiers, just plain civilians, just living their lives. And here comes the Germans killing them, 32,000, along with other 87,000 injured. So, I mean, yeah, that's over 100,000 victims of the air raids. I mean, talk about hitting, like, trying to put morale down. And 60% of houses in London were destroyed, which, well, in England, 2 million, but 60% of those in London. I mean, by this point, nowadays London is huge and has a lot of buildings, but by this time, London was heavily populated, but less. But imagine nowadays, you're in London and 60%, 6 in every 10 houses have been destroyed. That's huge amounts of destruction, and really old buildings were destroyed because of this. Again, all part of the German plan. It wasn't just an accident. The bombs were there were different types of bombs. It wasn't just one bomb. High explosive and century bombs. And high explosive just to cause explosions, and century bombs to cause fires, and oil bombs. But some bombs, like 1 in every 10, was a dud, which meant that it didn't really explode. And nowadays there's still bombs from the Blitz just lying around, and of course people don't really want to go near them because what if they suddenly explode? Some of them had a delay action fuse, so they could go off at any time, intentionally. So civilians, or group of civilians, or police, or whatever, went to look at the bomb and examine it and take it back for analysis. In any point, it could just explode. So it was almost impossible to tell which bombs were actually, some didn't explode, which bombs would explode at random times. So if a bomb fell and didn't explode, everyone has to be evacuated. Make sure the bomb is safe, and then repopulate that house or whatever. A lot of trouble. Again, that was the whole point of the German plan. So that was from 1944 onwards, different types of weapons would be used at war, but these were bombs used for other bombings, not the Blitz. So I'm not really going to get into that because it's not really relevant. So, the V1 exploded in Kent for the first time, and the V2, they arrived with any warning, so that was one of the types, one of the results of those prototypes of silent bombers that were tried in the Blitz. But these I'm not really going to get into it because they were 1944, and although there were bombings to civilians from 1941 onwards, these periods of heavy bombing were really from 1940 1941. So if you hear about the Blitz, it's more about these months rather than the entire bombings to civilians. Because the British also carried these bombings, but not to the extent the Germans did. Like I said, how the people protected themselves from these air raids? Well, they went into air raid shelters, which were especially constructed because of this, or even the underground. And they had, at first they were just plain areas, but eventually I think they ended up putting food there or water, because they didn't know how long these raids could last. They could be really fast. It could be just in 10 minutes, so all the planes would go through, or it could be just constant planes going over and over for an entire night. So it had to keep eating, had to keep drinking, had to go to the bathroom somehow. So at first it was just plain areas, then eventually food, water, toilets started appearing. And life during this period was horrible. I don't know how people survived in this. You couldn't really go out because you were afraid sometimes, like, a bomb would just fall. You were in London especially, you would spend most of your day rather than at home in these air raid shelters, because what if you left home, then an air raid came and you had to walk all the way back. But in that period of walking all the way back to the air raid shelter, you could get killed. So most people just stayed in these air raid shelters, hence the food, the water. They need to survive somehow. And so, people living in the countryside or villages, they were still uneasy because they could still be bombed, But if you live in the cities, especially Cardiff, London, Coventry, Birmingham, you couldn't really sleep at night because even if you were at home or even an air raid shelter, you were afraid bombs would fall, and also there was this really real fear that paratroopers would just Germans would just come down and start invading London instead of bombs, people. So that was a real fear. There's actually many books written about this. I cannot really name any of them right now, but there are a lot of books. You just look books about the Blitz, a ton, and a lot of them focus on this fear, because that was the German intent. This caused fear and paranoia in the population so much that they don't want to leave their houses. They don't want to contribute to the war production. But I mean, they did. It didn't really work to the extent that Germans wanted. I've said this before, but it's true. And I mean, there was bombs on the countryside, so it wasn't like people in the countryside were safe. They just were safer because it was less likely. But still, they still bombed the countryside because you can never be too safe. And of course, there was no nightlife. In London, big cities, they would have a blackout. You can have any lights out, with hopes that the Germans would not see the town and just not bomb there. And you can, if you walked out on the street, you could make as little noise as you could. There were actually policemen patrolling, making sure no one had a torch or a flashlight or whatever. But you couldn't really go out because you couldn't see anything. There were no street lights, nothing. And you couldn't really go out, A, fear, B, because you couldn't see a thing. It was horrible. I think we have it bad now with COVID. At that point, it was... we couldn't have life then. That's what war does. Some children, to be saved, were evacuated and taken to, I was going to say France, but obviously not France, the US, Spain, and not that many places in Europe, because a lot of Europe was controlled by Germany. So a lot of people were just evacuated because, especially children, because they had to be saved. And this caused a generation of just living shortly away from their parents. It was horrible. Like, we think we have it bad now, but back then, in the midst of war, there's again a ton of books, a ton about this period. One that really comes to mind about the evacuation of people is Friend or Foe. I read this ages ago when I was back in primary. It's really good. I mean, it's for primary, but I highly recommend it. And there was, apart from evacuation, food was rationed because production couldn't be kept up at the pace it had been before. So you can only get certain amounts of food, and you can't exactly get them everywhere because a lot of shops were destroyed. So you can eat as much, but also you can, even though you had the money, you can really buy them because the shops you went to were either closed because of the fear of the owners, or closed because the owners had been killed, or just bombed. So that was a problem. So rationing became really, really, really severe. And once the Blitz was over, because they stopped eventually because the Germans couldn't keep up, they had to focus on other stuff. Red forts came up and when the platforms off Kent, and these were anti-aircraft carriers. But like I said, these were not relevant to the Blitz. They were relevant to other air raids, but not the Blitz in particular. So these weren't present during the Blitz, and that's why I'm not really gonna talk about them that much. And like I said, the Blitz ended May 1941 because Germans couldn't keep up because they were focusing on other parts of Europe, but also they were getting ready to invade Russia. They invaded Russia in June 41, so they needed those airplanes for Russia. And I think if they had just focused on Britain, they had continued with the dogfighting the Battle of Britain, and also continued with the Blitzkrieg. They could have invaded Britain. Just think, if they had kept this going on for a few more months, say even past the summer, one whole year of constant bombing, it would be costly for the Germans, but the British couldn't leave alive, and they would be really, really, like the morale would have been so low. And the Germans could have probably won the war if they had done this, but Hitler's ambition got the best of him, and he ended up losing the war because of it. And now there were huge attacks later on, like I said, the V1, the V2, but not really part of the Blitz, so not really relevant to this video. So yeah, that is pretty much it. That is the Blitz. It's not in a huge amount of detail, but still, it's a terrifying period to have lived through. I think there's still people alive who, not that many, but who have lived through the Blitz, and there's testimonies, and it was terrible. The conditions, you couldn't really go out. You couldn't see your friends. Schools were closed. It was a horrible place to live, and that's the damage of war. But the Germans were generally quite successful. But like 32,000 killed and 87,000 injured. But yeah, just kept this on going. They could have won, but Hitler's ambition with Russia got the best of him. So yeah, that is it. Thank you for watching. Bye.